Alright, so I'm back here with another video on the Gladius ROV. In this video I'm going to be talking about some of the considerations that you might want to think about when you first come to introduce the Gladius to water and start learning how to use it. So I really do advise, for the first use at least, putting the Gladius into something where it's clean and safe and there's lots of visibility, and where you can go swimming for it if you need to recover it. It's unlikely that you'll need to do that, but just in case and for peace of mind, it's better to use it in an environment like that. So ideally you would use it in a very, very clear lake or a swimming pool or something like that, and get a good idea of how to use it in that environment. Have a look at what your tether is doing, and then once you're happy with the controls, happy with the interface and what you see on the HUD, then you can introduce it to a more complex bit of water where you might have obstacles to navigate around and things like that. So the first thing you'll want to do is make sure that you've got the correct buoyancy module installed. The buoyancy module is just here on the bottom. Currently got the seawater one attached because I was most recently in the ocean with the Gladius. And in the kit you should have also received a freshwater module. Very easy to switch out. You've got two screws here and here. Unscrew those guys and swap it out. The freshwater module just has a bit of a block of foam in there for additional buoyancy. And the seawater module just has a couple of little blocks of lead for added weight. So make sure you're using the right one. If you're using the seawater one in freshwater, more than likely the drone is going to be negatively buoyant and it's going to sink to the bottom rather than naturally float to the top. And likewise, if you're using the freshwater one in seawater, you're going to have a bit of trouble keeping the Gladius at depth, and it's going to want to float to the surface very, very easily. So keep that in mind. It's also a good idea, if you do use the Gladius in seawater, to give it a really, really good rinse in fresh water. Maybe fill a bucket with water, chuck it in and run the props a little bit just to make sure you clear as much salt as possible, salt, sand, anything like that, out of the props and the motors, because the brushless motors in here will actually contact the seawater, and you do want to get that off as much as possible before you put it back into storage. When you first introduce the Gladius to the water, you'll notice that there's a couple of vent holes in here, and the casing is actually going to be filled with air, so it's a good idea to roll it from side to side and tilt it forwards and backwards underneath the water just to get all of those extra air bubbles out, because if there's any air bubbles trapped in there, that's going to add to your buoyancy, and it's going to make your controls a little bit more difficult to use, and it's also going to be more difficult to maintain the proper depth. So just give it a rinse in the water, make sure you get as much of the air bubbles out as possible, and you should be good to go. Another thing to think about is your tether. This is not a particularly strong tether, so you don't want to be yanking on this to recover your drone if you can help it. You also want to be mindful not to get this tangled up in any obstacles under the water. Now it is mostly buoyant in both freshwater and seawater, so it'll tend to float to the top. I have had the Gladius so far in environments where there are branches and sticks and rocks under the water, as well as around an old shipwreck in the ocean, where there's lots of coral and obstacles and chunks of metal and wooden beams and things like that to get hung up on. And so far I haven't actually gotten the Gladius hung up on anything, which I'm very glad about. So it seems to have done quite a good job at keeping the tether out of these obstacles. Just keep in mind that when you take the Gladius out, there is a good chance that you could get it hung up on an obstacle. So maybe bring a pair of shorts and an old pair of shoes if you do need to go in and free it up. And on that same subject, I generally have always brought the Gladius back into shore with about 30% left on the battery. I don't like to run it any lower than that, because if I do come across a snag and I get the tether snagged, I've got that extra bit of juice left in the tank to use the Gladius itself to have a look at the snag and see if perhaps I can unsnag itself using the camera to have a look at what object you might be hung up on, and also maybe shift into a higher power mode where you can kind of jerk that cable free if that is hung up on a branch or something like that. Like I've said, that hasn't happened to me so far, and really I've been quite impressed with that it hasn't been an issue at all. Obviously never take the Gladius underneath an obstacle unless you're certain that you can come back the same way, because your tether is going to be hung up on whatever obstacle you've gone underneath and you're going to have a bad day. Also keep in mind that as you are moving through the water, your props, your thrusters are going to be kicking up quite a lot of silt and sand, which is going to muddy the water. So you might have nice, clear, clean water on your way out to look at a particular feature underwater, but on the way back you may encounter much less visibility, much dirtier water, and it may be more difficult for you to find your way back. And one last thing about the tether is that if you are venturing out offshore, maybe 50, 60 meters or so, and then you're on your way back to have a look at something else, make sure you reel in any extra tether, and you don't have, meters and meters of it floating out there in the water, because in seawater or even in fresh water, that could very well be washed up on shore and get hung up on an obstacle there. So try not to leave too much of your tether floating free in the water, just enough so that the Gladius can get around and do its own thing. So just keep in mind that you should be regularly reeling in any extra tether that you've got floating around in the water. And also with the tether, as it's unspooling from the buoy, keep in mind that it's not rubbing against any abrasive material, so it's not rubbing against a rock or a bit of concrete or even any coral that you encounter in the water, because given enough of that abrasion, you could damage the cable. And if the cable is damaged while the ROV is out in the water, obviously you're going to lose some or all of the control over the device. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, that's pretty much the bulk of the main considerations with using the Gladius. Like I said, start off in some fresh, clean water, maybe a swimming pool, something like that, and I'm sure you'll have a really good time learning it. And it really shouldn't take a long time to get a handle on how to use the controls, and pretty soon you'll be comfortable putting it out into a more complex bit of water. Anyway, that's it. I hope you have a lot of fun with your Gladius in the water. Take lots of pictures and videos and share them with your friends. I hope that's been helpful for you, and thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.